Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another Medical Projects webinar this evening. Normally, we would do our webinars on a Wednesday, but I think everybody was a little bit busy yesterday evening, so we've moved it to today. So thanks for joining us. Just to give you a brief kind of overview of who I am and what we do here, if you've not kind of joined any Medical Projects webinars before. My name's Mark Williams. I work here at Medical Projects, and we help students on their journey to medical school. And we've been running these kind of free webinars for nearly a year now. It was kind of a reaction to the first kind of lockdown. They've just been really popular, and hopefully you find this one really useful tonight. We'll be looking at a bit of a tricky topic or topics. I know a lot of you will be kind of preparing for your UCAT. You've probably already got it booked in, and you'll be going through that process of learning kind of how to tackle the UCAT and trying to maximize your scores. So hopefully tonight we're going to go through a couple of example questions, and we're just going to work through the logic behind it as well. And if that helps you with your kind of revision and with your studies, then fantastic. We'll also have a bit of time to kind of ask our medical student Matthew a few questions at the end. So if you've got anything in particular, we'll try and keep it based around UCAT, given that's the topic this evening. So if you've got any questions about the UCAT or about these sections, then we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end as well. Just before we get going, I'm just going to launch up a quick poll, and this is just for us just to work out kind of who's watching, and if you've joined one of our webinars before, or if it's your first time. It's just always good for us to know. So I'll give that a second. Normally it's about kind of 60% have been to one of our webinars before, and 40% it's the kind of first one, and just looking at the stats at the moment, it looks like it's around that at the moment. So I'll share the results with you as well, just so you can kind of see who's watching as well. So 36% this is your first one, so welcome to you. We hope you enjoy it, and welcome back to everybody else that's come back and is watching again. So I'll just go through a quick few housekeeping rules before we jump in and we kind of introduce Matthew as well. This webinar will finish before 8 o'clock. We definitely won't run over an hour. We appreciate giving up some time of your evening, so we'll keep it short. We will email a recording of this webinar out and a copy of the slides as well, probably tomorrow or at least within 48 hours. We will have a Q&A section at the end, and we use the Q&A tool on Zoom. So if you type your questions in the chat box, they won't get answered in there. So please use the Q&A tool. If somebody else has already asked a question that you would like answering as well, then you can use the upvote system, which is the thumbs up button, and it will bring it to the top so you can answer the most popular questions first. Okay, cool. Probably time to introduce Matthew. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Good. And you've actually been doing some kind of teaching on the UCAT today as well, haven't you? So this is a timely webinar for you as well.
That's right, yeah, this afternoon. So good time to do it.
Okay, I know kind of 36% of people tonight, they are new, so maybe not have kind of seen or kind of been to one of the webinars you were on before. So I don't know if you just want to start with a bit of a background to you, and then I guess if you want to just jump into some of the UCAT teaching.
Yeah, sure, sounds great. So I think that's on the next slide, so we may as well get started then.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so good evening, everyone. As Mark said, I'm Matthew. I'm a medical student at King's College London, and I'm going to be giving this talk today about the abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning sections of the UCAT. So just a brief thing about me. I'm from East London. I'm currently studying medicine here at King's, and I took the UCAT, although it was called the UCAT, but it's essentially the same thing, in August 2018. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this webinar is not to give you an overview of the entire UCAT exam itself, but obviously we're going over those two sections, starting with abstract reasoning. So I'm going to jump straight in here. So what is the abstract reasoning section? Well, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, it's one section of the UCAT, one one section of what they call the cognitive tests, the 4 cognitive tests, which is coupled with the situational judgment test. And according to what they wrote on the consortium website, the section assesses your ability to identify patterns amongst abstract shapes where irrelevant and distracting material may lead to incorrect conclusions. That last bit of the sentence is extremely relevant for what I'm going to be talking about this evening. There are many, many examples of questions where the consortium, where the test makers try and throw you off with shapes that aren't, and patterns that aren't really relevant to the main pattern that you need to find. And another important point, there are 55 questions in total, divided into 13 different question sets. That is to say, you could be asked multiple questions on one question set. And you have a total of 30 minutes to complete this section in total, which I'm sure you can appreciate isn't actually a lot of time. And therefore, you've got 1 minute per question set, so to speak. Next slide, please. So like the other cognitive subtests, as I mentioned, for the abstract reasoning, you're going to receive a score at the end of your exam. Straight away after the exam, I should add, that's a really important point, that you get your results on the day of the test. And you'll get a score between 300 and 900 for each section, including this section. And you can just see this little chart that I've put in, which gave this sort of, these are the average scores from 2020. And you can see if you scroll down to abstract reasoning, the average score was 653 out of 900. So that would be smack bang the 50th percentile, the sort of bang average score on the curve that they would put you on. Next slide, please. So although this is from the consortium website and these are practice questions, the screen that you're going to see before commencing this section of the UCAT will be very, very similar to this. In fact, it will be identical, except it won't say practice questions at the top. So you're going to have 4 different question types. Type 1, you'll have 2 sets of shapes labeled set A and set B. For type 2, you're going to be given a series of shapes, and then you have to work out the pattern and then select the next shape in the series. For type 3, you're going to be given a statement involving a group of shapes, and then asked to determine which shape completes the statement. So what shape comes next, that kind of line of thinking. And for type 4, you're going to be presented with 2 sets of shapes labeled set A and set B, like with type 1, and you'll be asked to select which of the 4 response options belongs to either set. This is really important to note because all of the questions follow these generic types of question types, so to speak. But that knowledge in itself is not necessarily going to give you a good mark. What is going to give you a good mark is practice. And I'm going to be talking about practice a lot during this webinar because it's really the only way to secure a good mark in the UCAT exam. People say you can't revise for the UCAT. I suppose that's true to an extent. You're not revising content, but what you are revising and practicing is your technique. And that's a really, really important sort of distinction to make. And with better technique will come a better score. I'll talk about this a bit more later on in the webinar, and I'll talk about what resources you guys can use in order to practice, but we'll get to that later on. Next slide, please. So for this section of the UCAT, the abstract reasoning section, how does one prepare? So like the whole of this exam, you do not need any prior biomedical science knowledge, any medical knowledge, any sort of revision from a syllabus in order to answer the questions well. As I said before, what will make you answer the questions well is practice and getting used to the types of questions the exam board like to ask. That is quite distinctly different from, for example, learning about a load of ions in chemistry or learning about, I don't know, the structure of a protein. So in order to prepare well, you're going to need to use a sort of variety of different resources and make sure that you familiarize yourself with a diverse range of question types. As I said, this will improve your technique and it will allow you to spot things quicker in the exam. The one thing I will say in the UCAT in general, and this is especially pertinent in this section, is that time is really your enemy. You only have 13 minutes to answer 55 questions. And for a lot of the questions, there are multiple layers to the patterns that they're asking you to sort of decipher. I should mention that there's a UCAT masterclass here at Medical Projects that's given by my friend Olivia, also at King's. and she's been teaching here for a few years now, and she's, you know, absolutely brilliant at teaching all components of the UCAT, so I'd recommend that. And as I've said, practice really is the most important point to make here. Next slide, please. So we're going to just jump into a sample question. I should say before you know, doing this, that this is only one question type. As I said, there are those 4 different types of questions, and these slides I'm sure will be made available to you after this session. And you can have a look at them, and you can go on the UCAT Consortium website and look for yourself. And the more practice you do, the more questions you do, the more you'll be able to spot the different types of questions and therefore answer them better. But anyway, with that being said, would you all like to have a go at this question? So you've got 2 sets here of shapes. So which of the following test shapes belongs in set A?
I haven't got the poll set up. The polling isn't working for this, so we might have to type the questions or the answers into the chat box, and we can roughly see what most people are going for. If you want to get a group answer anyway. Sure,
I'll do that then for the next question, and I won't go on too long because then there'll be like 200 answers in the chat. Okay, so yeah, you guys can stop answering now. Most of you have got the correct answer, I think. So the correct answer is A. If you could reveal it, Mark. Yeah. So next slide, please. There should be an explanation. So before I get into this explanation, I just want to make quite an important point. You know, you guys can see just from eyeballing, and this is the official explanation given on the consortium website for this question. I'm sure you guys can see just from eyeballing this that there's a lot of different, you know, there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of explanation here. But the thing is, if you look back to the question, if you had spotted one thing, i.e. that in set A, the white circle splits into 2 shapes and the grey circle splits into 1, and vice versa for set B, you would have actually got the question right without needing to know any of the other blurb that they put in. But going back to the explanation anyway. So as you can read, set A starts from a black square, and then a line to a white circle splits into 2. A line to a shaded circle goes through a single line followed by a white shape or a dark shape. The ends of the connected pattern are squares. Set B also starts from a black square. A line to a shaded circle splits into 2 to a white shape and a dark shape. A line to a white circle goes through to a single line followed by a white shape or dark shape, and the ends of the connected patterns are square. And the reason that A was correct was because it starts from a black square. This then splits into a white shape that splits into 2, a black square and a white shape. The white shape splits into 2, and that is a black square and a white square, and that, of course, fits A. But what I should say is that, as I said before, if you had just spotted that simple trick, you wouldn't have needed to know the rest of the reasoning behind the question. Now, the important point is you have, you know, on average, 1 minute per question set. And well, what's 55 divided by 13? It's not a lot. You know, you don't have long to answer each question. And remember, they're all worth 1 mark. That's never going to change. So what you need to say to yourself is, if you see it, so to speak, if you see the pattern instinctively, try and go with your gut. Don't overthink it. Don't chew up too much time. Time is really important to factor in with the UCAT. And this is a good example of why it is. So next slide, please. So the takeaway points for the abstract reasoning section. There are many different styles, 4 styles, as I mentioned, of abstract reasoning questions. In order to do well, you need to familiarize yourself with each type of question they can ask. The resources that I would recommend, I'm going to mention at the end of the webinar, so bear with me. And I will tell you about what I think is good. But the fact is, you need to consistently practice using those resources. You need to put aside time, whether that's a free period at school, whether that's a bit of spare time in the evening, whether that's after your homework. And the sort of month before your exam, you need to increase the level of your practice if you want to do well and if you want to sort of reach your peak, so to speak. And as that practice question demonstrated, try not to waste too much time overthinking questions in the actual exam. Because if you do that, you'll quickly find that you're running out of time, and then you're going to panic and you're going to have to guess anyway. So once you've got an answer that you're sure of, stick with it and move on. That's the best example. That's the best advice, rather, I can give you. And as I said, from the, as you can see from the practice question, sometimes just instinctively spotting it, or spotting one pattern instead of the 4 or 5 that's actually in the explanation, is more efficient than working out every rule possible, and actually more feasible given the time that you have. Next slide, please. So moving on to the verbal reasoning section. So what is it? It's another section of these 4 cognitive subtests of the UCAT. It's also graded on a scale from 300 to 900, like the abstract reasoning section. And according to the UCAT Consortium website, this section assesses your ability to read and think carefully about information presented in passages, and to determine whether specific conclusions can be drawn from information presented. So, that's quite wordy, but essentially what they're trying to tell you is that you're going to be given paragraphs of information. That information could be based on anything. It could be based on medical politics. It could be based on, current affairs. It could be based on science. And you, as the exam taker, are going to have to take out the salient information from that paragraph in a short period of time, and then proceed to answer questions about it. So in total, there are 11 passages of text, each with 4 associated questions. And I'm sure you can appreciate that gives you a total of 44 questions, 4 per passage of text. And in total, you have 21 minutes to answer these 44 questions. So again, the exam is quite brutal when it comes to time. I can tell you from personal experience and from the experiences of a lot of my friends at medical school that this section rather of the UCAT is extremely pressing for time. I personally found it okay, but I have a lot of friends that really struggled actually. But in the next few slides, I'm going to teach you a few tips on how to overcome that. So next slide, please. So as I said before, for the abstract reasoning section, this is roughly the type of screen that you're going to encounter on the day of the test. I should mention that the UCAT exam, as you all know, is taken in a testing centre. If any of you have done your driving theory, it's likely that you'll sit the exam, or you'll be given the option to sit the exam in the same testing centre rather. And before commencing this section, this is the screen you're going to see. So you're going to be presented with passages to read, each associated with 4 questions. Some of these questions assess critical reasoning skills, requiring you to infer and draw conclusions from the information. You will then be presented with a question or incomplete statement and 4 response options. So you're required to pick the best or most suitable response. And for other questions, your task is to read each passage of text carefully and then decide whether the statement provided follows logically. There are 3 answer options you can choose from, so true, false, and can't tell. It's really important to note for the can't tell option, it has to be 100% clear that you cannot tell from the information in the passage whether the statement is true or false. Equally, for the true or false, there has to be overriding evidence that the statement that they provide is true or false. And you can usually infer that from the paragraph itself. All of the questions, as with the entirety of this exam, are worth 1 mark, and that's extremely important to bear in mind. So next slide, please. So just before we get into the question itself, I'd just like to make a point about this paragraph here and about the nature of this part of the UCAT. So as you can see, this is again a very wordy paragraph. It's full of jargon. It's full of numbers. You need to say to yourself when you're approaching this section of the UCAT, and when you're approaching your revision and your practice, you need to say, how can I efficiently get the salient information, the important information from the paragraphs that are provided? Because the truth is, as I said, you have 21 minutes to complete 44 questions. You're not going to be able to pick apart everything they write here. You're not going to be able to even really read it through fully. you need to practice your skim reading, and you need to practice taking out the important bits of information from the paragraph and storing that in your short-term memory so you can answer the questions. That skill is definitely something you can practice in the same way that you can practice the styles of questions that come up in the abstract reasoning. And as I said before, the more questions that you do, the better you will become at all of this. And I'll talk later on about what you can use to do that. But that's really the important point here. So I will read out the text. If the questions that are going to follow won't have the text there, so it's going to be in the style of the exam, to give you a taste of what it's like. But if you do want to sort of take a photo of this, if you want, to answer the questions better, then go ahead. So UK house prices appear to have defied economic gravity over the past year. The lockdowns triggered by the pandemic led to a 10% fall in GDP, the largest fall in 300 years since the Great Frost of 1709. The latest data shows house prices have grown at the fastest annual rate, which is 13.4% in 17 years. Are we in the midst of another housing bubble? An optimistic scenario is that the current boom is driven by the unusual circumstances of the pandemic rather than more systemic problems. Spending more time at home has led many homeowners to desire more space and a better environment. They have used the record build-up of household savings amassed during the lockdowns and supported by the government's furlough scheme to buy larger homes or move out of cities. Property prices outside cities have increased by 14% compared with 7% rather within them. The introduction of the stamp duty holiday by the government further ramped up the demand for such purchases. Phasing out of this subsidy at the end of June may help explain the most recent upturn in growth rates as people scramble to complete purchases. Once it ends, prices will probably flatten or fall for a few months, but it will be a soft landing as recent price rises reflect the ongoing structural changes to our working habits and desire for increased living space. So I'm not going to go over the main points in that because it will give the answers away, but just have in mind as you're answering the questions, what the main points from that paragraph are, what the main topic at hand is, and what they could potentially ask you. So next question, please. So is this true, false, or can't tell? The price of the properties within cities has decreased since the start of the pandemic.
Do you want people just to type answers into the chat again so you can get a general feel?
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay, yeah, so if you could reveal the answer, please. So yeah, pretty much all of you got that correct, and I hope you can see why. And I hope you can see how, actually, if you look at the salient information from the paragraph they give you, it's actually, for the simpler questions like this, it's easier to infer what they're trying to ask. But that's only possible if you sort of take those important pieces of information and think about it in your head. So next question, please. So GDP in the UK is at its lowest, and they've used a big term here, lowest, since the Great Frost of 1709. Whenever you see something like lowest, highest, greatest, you know that, again, if you've looked at the important information from the blurb, you'll be able to answer it well. Okay, interesting, more of a mix. So if we could get the answer, please. So it's actually can't tell. I hope you can see why. It didn't actually explicitly say. I believe it said in the passage that the GDP in the UK is lower than the Great Frost, but it didn't say lowest relative. I think it said since the Great Frost, which would imply that since that point. Sorry, my fault. It said that the GDP in the UK. Sorry. GDP in the UK is at its lowest since the Great Frost of 1709. Right. So it wasn't saying that it's at its lowest of all time. It was saying that it was lowest relative to the Great Frost of 1709. And that's an important distinction that I've just got confused about. So I appreciate why some of you said it was true. But in order to practice those type of questions, you need to practice your logical reasoning. And that's actually particularly important in that example. And that's why I got confused. making that distinction between the largest fall, as someone's just corrected me, thank you, compared to the actual lowest point of all, in itself, that's an important distinction to make, and something that you can fall up on, and I just did. So, right, next slide, please. Thank you, Cole, for pointing that out, by the way. So question 3, which of the following sentences is inferred from the text? So A, once the pandemic is finished, the property prices will probably flatten or fall for a few months. B, the Great Frost is an economic landmark used as a default situation when describing any economic situation. C, stamp duty holiday was introduced to help people buy new homes. And D, stamp duty holiday will start phasing out in June. Okay, so if you could reveal the answer, please. So the answer is actually D. A and B here, I think hopefully you can agree you can quickly rule those out. They're quite superfluous answers. Once the pandemic is finished, the property prices will probably flatten or fall. That's very much, they're not committing to something there. And the fact that the question in itself is asking you to infer something, it's almost a double inference. And they're never going to ask you to do that. If they're asking you to infer something from the text, they're asking you to infer a definitive point or definitive situation. And similarly with B, the Great Frost is an economic landmark used as a default situation when describing any economic situation. That again is very wordy. C and D, it's more of a toss-up between these two. So stamp duty holiday was introduced to help people buy new homes, but actually the answer is that it will start phasing out in June. And I don't have the text in front of me, so unfortunately I can't give you a full information, a full explanation. But I hope that for those of you that did take a photo, or you can go back and view it later on, it will be clear to you why that is the case. So final question, please. So question 4, which of the following is untrue based on the text? So A, the price of properties outside cities has increased by less than 10%. B, property prices have grown at an annual rate of 13.4%. C, the prices of properties within cities has increased by more than 5%. And D, the difference between the increase of the house prices outside and within cities is 7%. So more mixed here. So it's probably the hardest question, actually. And just a heads up, they do like to throw in double negatives by saying stuff like, which of the following is untrue, or what cannot be inferred from the text. And I always found myself in my own experience that those questions were actually harder, because it's almost like you've got 3 answers that would be correct and 1 that's wrong. And therefore it's harder to find, it's harder to spot and to kind of stick with. So could you reveal the answer, please, Mark? So the actual answer is A. I believe, I can't give you exact numbers because I don't have it in front of me, but there was from when I looked at it earlier, there was a mathematical reason why this was the case. So the price of properties outside cities has increased by less than 10%. And again, by reading the text thoroughly, I'm sure you guys can appreciate why that is the case. Now, hopefully you've appreciated from these questions actually how hard it is to store the information in your head. I mean, me not even having it in front of me, although I've read it before preparing for this talk, and I made the slides myself, I couldn't even remember a lot of the information myself. What I would say is the reason that I was able to do it, and I was able to do it well, I got a pretty good score, I think 760 in this part of the UCAT, was because I practiced a hell of a lot, and I practiced more or less every day for a month before going into the exam itself. And what you find, and obviously I'm rusty now because I haven't done it for 3 years, is the more that you practice, the quicker your brain gets at pulling out those important pieces of information and therefore being able to infer the logic that the test makers are asking of you to answer the questions. So next slide, please. So takeaway points from the verbal reasoning section. Do not overread, as I've reiterated. You need to get the salient information quickly from the passage, and you need to store those important points in your head. And this can only be achieved through consistent, diligent practice. Don't waste too much time overthinking certain questions. For example, that question that I got confused about, if you find yourself in the exam in a similar situation, don't waste time on it. You've got 44 questions in this section. You can get an extremely good score by getting 10 wrong, right? They're all worth 1 mark. If you find yourself in that situation, make sure that you go straight on. You just guess if it comes down to it, because the brutally honest truth is you don't have enough time to chew over it and to overanalyze your answer. And that would really, if all else fails, that is my main exam technique or tip for the UCAT in general, and that actually applies to the other sections of the exam as well. So next slide, please. And I've just put this slide finally here because this is what you're going to see at the end of doing your test. You're going to get the 4 cognitive subtests, and you're going to get a total score with all of them added together. And then the situation of judgment, which I gave a webinar on last week, or 2 weeks ago rather, will be a banded score rather than a score between 300 and 900. It's important to note that those cognitive subtests are what give you your overall main score, and then you get a band score for the SJT. So next slide, please. So thank you all very much for listening. I should stress the importance of the fact that although I went through those sample questions, they are purely there to give you a taster, if you like, less than a taster of what it's like. And I'm sure I'm going to answer some questions about this in a minute, but the main thing that you need to bear in mind is how much practice you put into each subtest of the exam and what you use to practice. So does anyone have any questions? And thank you very much for listening.
So when you were revising, you said that you revised for about a month every single day. Like, how long each day were you doing when you did yours?
Yeah, so it's probably slightly inaccurate to say I did it every day. What I would say is I built up my revision. So say a month is 4 weeks, for example, I would do revision every other day for the first week, and then for the next 3 weeks, I'd do it every day. But the time I spent every day would increase as the weeks went on. So I can't remember exactly what I did. I didn't have a set schedule that I wrote down, but I managed to do it. And it was something along the lines of, I did 2 hours the second week every day, and then the next week I did 4, and then the final week I was sort of, really almost doing it constantly, but making sure that I gave myself enough sleep and enough physical rest to make sure that my body and my mind were in a good state to be at my sort of peak for the exam. Obviously that worked for me. I suppose it would work for a lot of people as well to build up your revision like that, but I don't want to speak on behalf of everyone, because I know that everyone has got different learning methods, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is for people to understand what their own revision and learning methods are. Some people might do 5 weeks and just do an hour a day, and just that consistency works for them. Other people will do big chunks of time, and they'll do 2 or 3 hours in a massive chunk, and that'll work for them. Other people need breaks in times of things, but I guess it's just being self-aware and measuring your scores as well. That's something that we always talk about on our courses, is making sure that you track your scores and know that you're going in the right direction, because sometimes with these kind of tests, you can push yourself into a tunnel where you're just doing the same thing over and over and over again. You're not actually improving. So tracking your scores in each section is really important as well. So that's one thing that we always kind of talk about. Did you ever do any of that or did you just kind of just plow on with revision? Did you know you were getting better as you were going?
No,
along?
I did. Yeah. So I'll go into this, once I start answering the actual Q&A questions. But I actually use Medify mainly for my revision. In regards to the question bank that I used, I'm aware that there are different question banks available online, and of course, I'd all recommend you guys to at least look at the UCAT crash course that Medical Projects offer. There's also a lot of good there's a lot of good resources on the consortium website itself. It's where I got those screenshots for what you see before each subset of the test. But no, to answer your question, I was monitoring my score and making sure that I was improving as I went along. But equally, if you do find that you have a few days or a week where you do worse, don't be disheartened. Keep going. That's really important, and because ultimately it will all add up when you get to the end.
Okay, I'm just gonna. I could have to stop the screen share so I can open the Q&A. So it's just going to be me and you on the screen. Okay, cool. Just have a look through the first question here. When answering the verbal reasoning question, should we look at the question first, then look at the passage to find the answer, and then find a particular word that that question relates to?
Right, that's a good question. Should we look at the question first? And I just want to make sure that I've understood it properly. Yes, right. So this is something that I would highly, highly recommend, and it's something I did myself in the exam. When I was talking about the important information, the salient information, I was talking about key words and phrases, key figures that they've put in the blurb that they give you, and matching that up with what you see in the questions. Now, for what Said's written here, what I wouldn't suggest doing is just going straight into the questions and then sort of tracking back, so to speak, and looking at the words in the questions and then trying to find that in the paragraph. That's not a good way of doing it, because, for example, say they've quoted a number twice in the paragraph, but the question's asking about two different contexts of that number, you could actually completely misinterpret the question. So it's really important, either whatever your strategy is, to skim the question first and to get a broad sense of what they're talking about. So that would be my answer to that. But equally, once you have skimmed, that's actually a really, really good tactic. And that, as I say, that's something I employed myself, and I got a good mark from doing that.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different strategies, and this is something we talk about on the course as well, and you've got to find the one that works best for you. Some people like to read the passage first and then go and answer the questions after that. Some people like to read all the questions first, which is a slightly new technique, and almost try and get an idea of what the questions are before they go and read the text, and then do a bit of skim reading and then match them up. When you're practicing, just try both different techniques and see which one starts to work best for you. It's the only way you're going to find out which technique works for you, is by trying a couple of different ones. But just try both ways and see what gets you the best scores.
Well said.
Next one down. Do you have any tips for managing time when answering questions? It's the biggest challenge of the test, really, isn't it? Is managing your time, and knowing when to skip questions is really, really important. So
you're totally right. As I said, time is the main enemy. It's the main sort of challenge of this exam. I've always said this, and when I was taking the test and I was, in a webinar like you guys, or in a course, the first thing people would say to me is, if you had the whole day to do this exam, you'd probably get 100%. If you were able to really think about your answers and think about the questions. But the fact is, you don't have that. You have a very, very limited amount of time. That's especially actually relevant in the two sections that we've discussed today. I've found from my own experience and from talking to people that the abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning sections are often some of the hardest pushed for time. So to answer your question, LeBron, do you have any tips for managing time and answering questions? So my first tip is something that I've already discussed. If you find yourself stuck, or you find yourself overthinking a question, just say to yourself, they're all one mark. Go with your gut, guess if you need to, and move on. It's the best advice I can give anyone, because ultimately you've got hundreds of different questions that you're answering in this whole exam. If you waste, say, 2-3 minutes on a question where you could have answered 5 and got 4 right, well, none of you are stupid. That you'd obviously all rather choose the next one. But I appreciate in the heat of the exam and in the heat of the moment, it's difficult to kind of think rationally and logically about these kind of things, which is why I'm telling you, have it in the back of your mind and mentally prepare for this before the exam, mentally prepare for questions that you're not going to be able to necessarily get straight away, and be prepared to move on rather than being a perfectionist about it. The second tip that I'd sort of give to you is in between sections, take a few deep breaths, recompose yourself. Don't think, it's good to think about, your next plan for the section if you do have a plan, but make sure that you mentally reset. The skill set needed for each subcategory of the cognitive subtests of all subtly different skills. And due to that, you need a different sort of mentality and plan going into each one, and a different kind of mindset. And the best way to get into a different mindset is to just rest and just to take a few seconds just to compose yourself before you go into another section. And what you'll find is that you're less panicked and therefore you rush less.
Okay, cool. Next question down is, what is a reasonable UCAT score to be getting?
So that is an extremely subjective question, but I will answer it because there is a good way to answer it. Essentially, every year they put all of the UCAT scores sat by every candidate on a normal distribution curve. For those of you that do statistics, you'll know what that is, but essentially it's a statistical curve where everyone that takes the test is a mark on that curve. The peak of the curve, the median score, is going to be the 50th percentile or the average score for that section or for the entire test. And one of the first slides I had in this webinar this evening was the average scores for 2020. Those scores were the exact 50th percentile on that curve for that year. Now, to answer your question, I talked about this in our residential teaching session earlier on today. And you'll get more information about this if you sign up to other medical projects sessions. But all the different universities use the UCAT in different ways. Some have cutoffs that they stick by each year. That is to say, a university may say 2,600 is the cutoff, and that's what we're going to stick with, unless the distribution changes dramatically year by year. But generally speaking, what universities will do is they'll take a certain cutoff from the percentile on that curve that year. And therefore, it's hard to say what a reasonable UCAT score you can get, because that curve and that average changes year by year. So a reasonable score is all in the context and all relative to how everyone else did in your group, in your year group. Generally speaking, I can give you a general answer. Something like 2,700 and above is going to be very competitive usually. 2,800 and above, you're doing pretty well for yourself basically. But those average scores really do fluctuate, and the last 2 or 3 years they've fluctuated more than they had done in the past, actually, as the UKCAT has turned into the UCAT and the question bank has changed. So that's my answer to you. It changes year by year, but generally speaking, above 2,700 is very competitive. And
just on that point, can you very quickly explain the difference between the 2,000 something number and the 650 number or 720 number? Because there's always two numbers that get thrown around, and sometimes that can confuse people. Yeah, of course. So the number usually beginning with 2,000 is a cumulative score of all the different 4 cognitive subtest sections all added up. And the number 650, 700, 750, which most people refer to, is an average. So it's that overall score. Say I got 2,800, that would be my overall score, but my average score would be 700. It's just that big score divided by 4, and that gives you an average score. So what score you got on average for each section. And of course, the SJT is completely unrelated to that score. You get a banded mark, and it doesn't contribute towards that score at all. Okay, cool. I know we touched on this before. How many weeks of revision should we do? Generally, you said that you did about 4 weeks. Would you kind of recommend that? Yeah, I mean, the truth is I did more because I started looking at the types of questions beforehand. But what I would say was my intense focused revision was those 4 weeks. I think that's, again, it's quite a subjective question. It depends how you learn.
very generally speaking, I would say do a month's worth of, if you do a month's worth of solid, meaningful, consistent revision, you're going to get a good score. Any more than 2 months, you're at risk of burning yourself out. And I'm aware that a lot of you will, have other responsibilities. You may have work, you're going to have your schoolwork, and you're going to have exams to take. So it's not necessarily good to say, I'm going to do it every day for 6 months. That's not going to work either. Remember that the UCAT is just one part of a much broader admissions process. And actually, a lot of the time, it just informs the universities whether you're going to get an interview or not. So bear that in mind and make sure you don't burn out at the same time.
Okay, cool. What score would you need to apply to the top medical schools that use the UCAT? Again, this can be a little bit subjective because they change it all the time.
Yep.
Can you remember what the kind of cutoff was for your university, or did you know what it was back then?
Yeah, so King's is a bit different. At King's, they don't actually use a cutoff. They're more holistic in their sort of assessment of each candidate. So they'll look at, for example, in my year, they looked at my UCAT score, they looked at my interview score, which you're not ever going to get back. That's internal to them. They looked at my GCSE grades, my A-level predicted grades, and my personal statement, and they literally collated that all. They must have made some kind of standardized score with all that information and then given me an offer based on that. But that is not to say that is the same for all other universities. For example, Edinburgh mainly care about the SJT. They care less about, your actual main score itself. They care more that you get a band 1. Equally, there are some unis, Barts, for example, that tend to have a cutoff every year, say the 30th percentile. And again, that varies. But as I said, anything generally above 2650, 2700 is going to be competitive for, say, the London universities that use the UCAT.
Yeah, Newcastle's always historically very high as well. They tend to use it or have a really high threshold for that as well.
Yeah.
If there's any universities that you're thinking about applying to, they tell you how they use the UCAT on their actual website as well, quite often.
They have to.
So if you've got the 4 in mind, or you've got, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 medical schools in mind that you think about applying to, go to every single one of their websites and they tell you what it is. So it's all there. The information is there for you. You just got to go to the website and find it. And it's not hard to find at all. And
this is something I was talking about earlier in regard to strategy, but make sure that whatever score that you do get, because you're going to get your score on the day, that you're strategic and realistic with yourself about where you therefore apply, and make sure you do your research thoroughly. As Mark just said, different unis use them in different ways, and you can find that all freely available on the internet.
Yeah, if you end up getting a UCAT score of, say, 650 and you've kind of got your heart set on Newcastle and their cut-off is 720, don't apply there. Even if you've got your heart set on it, it's the rest of your application is not going to help you. If they say, well, that's their cut-off, don't apply. You are going to just lose. You're going to waste one of your options there. Yeah. So get your score and then double check the universities you're applying to and make sure that you meet their criteria. Otherwise, you're just wasting an opportunity to get into medical school. It's harsh, but that's how you have to play the game.
It is, yeah.
Next one, will we be doing any webinars on personal statements? Yes, we'll probably do that in August time, maybe even September time, once everybody's got through summer and got through their summer work experience. So yes, we will do that. What books, websites do you recommend for preparing for the UCAT?
Right, so this is something I said I'd answer earlier, so this is a good opportunity too. I wouldn't stay away from them completely, but I'd just be cautious about the books. The reason I say that is from my own experience and from the experience of a lot of people I know. The questions that tend to come up in the books, and although they're good practice to do sort of at your leisure or in your free time, they're not really consistent with the style of questions you actually get in the exam. What is consistent, however, are question banks. And there's a really, really large question bank that can be found on the UCAT Consortium website. I didn't actually have, I was looking at it earlier today, and they've actually put hundreds of questions on there and in the style of the exam as well. So if you actually go on the website itself and click on it, you can take a mock test. And there's a lot of mock questions for you to do, and they're all in the same style of the questions they actually ask. Another good question bank is Medify, which, as I said, was what I personally used. And of course, as Mark's just put, here at Medical Projects, there are plenty of good resources to use. There's the website, of course. There's the UCAT crash course run by my friend Olivia, who will go into much more detail about each subsection and teach you specific tricks for each section and strategies that you can use and sort of personalize to yourself in order to do better. So I think ultimately it's important to have an open mind and use a range of resources. But if you do find something that really clicks with you and you find something that allows you to do consistent revision with, then I'd stay with that. Because the most important thing with all of this is consistency in your sort of planning and your revision and your practice.
Cool. I think that's probably a really good kind of point to end on. The practice and the resources that you use are going to be really important, and measuring and tracking that progress is going to be really important for you. I know this is we can only give so much information in the space of kind of just less than an hour. So have a look at all those other resources. I've put a couple of links in there as well to some of the things that Matthew was talking about. So you can go away and do a bit more kind of research and do some of the question banks on the UCAT website as well. Thank you very much for joining us. We really, really appreciate you kind of tuning in this evening, and thank you to you as well, Matthew. Just a message for the students as well. When you close Zoom down, it will actually take you to a feedback link. Something that's really important for medical students when they're doing these webinars is to get feedback. So we can all improve the way we deliver these webinars. So it takes less than 60 seconds. If you wouldn't mind just kind of filling in some feedback for us, that would be really appreciated. Thanks again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time on one of our next webinars, which again is, I'm pretty sure it's around UCAT. So have a look on the website for that, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. All right, cheers.
Bye.